and they have no clue of what they just purchased. And once again, they still don't fully believe this whole story. So with Andor Season 2 finally under wraps, I can say that I think we were 100% delivered what we were promised, which was a lot of people were saying that after watching Season 2, it's going to put a whole new perspective on watching, movies like Rogue One and Star Wars A New Hope. Now, for me personally, I think it puts a huge perspective on Star Wars A New Hope, just because it's just the big heavy-handedness of what's going on. I mean, we all know this when we watch it, but I just think like that scene when, Owen Lars or, Luke Skywalker, they purchase R2-D2, from the Jawas, and they have no clue of what they just purchased. Like, they single-handedly purchased the most expensive item in the entire galaxy. Not only that, but just a piece of hardware that's going to change the fate of the galaxy forever. We know this watching Star Wars A New Hope, but just seeing all that stuff beforehand again in Andor Season 2 and Rogue One, it just amps it up way more. So to me, that's personally why I got out of it. I kind of started thinking about the full timeline of how the Death Star plans, went from being created towards the end of them being, found by the rebels and the ultimate destruction of the Death Star. That was actually a really large timeline. I mean, we know it, but I actually went down a deep rabbit hole of researching, step by step what happened in order for, again, the plans of the Death Star to be created towards the end of the actual destruction of the Death Star. And it's actually a lot longer than you think. Like, just all of the hands and all the mouths that it passed through to get to that point, where at any of those points, things could have went a different way. And, the galaxy may still be completely under, the control of the Empire. So because of that, I put a full timeline together. So real quick, I'm actually going to put a timestamp in the video right here that goes towards the end. If you just want to see a quick 60-second, the bullet points of what occurred for the Death Star plans, jump ahead to that. But right now, we're going to go into the full description, starting with step 1, which is the original Death Star plans are put into design by the Geonosians, which were then passed on to Count Dooku, as we can see in episode 2, where Poggle the Lesser passes the plans over to Count Dooku for the full plans for the Death Star. And then that brings us to step 2, where Count Dooku then passes those plans on to Palpatine, aka Lord Sidious. Then that brings us to step 3, where the Death Star plans are actually put into construction, and actually Orson Krennic, who is an Imperial director, oversees the weapons development. And then he actually brings in Galen Erso, who is a brilliant energy scientist, but he's actually tricked into developing the Death Star super laser under the guise that it's some sort of like energy research project, which of course Galen eventually does learn the actual true intentions of the Death Star. Now I'm going to put a quick pin right here because there actually is a small split in the timeline for the Death Star plans, that being the Galen Erso side of the story, and then going on to the Andor side of the story. So we're going to go ahead and start with Andor just because that's the most recent thing that's come out, and I know it's fresh in everybody's minds. This brings us to step 4. Krennic actually pulls in a bunch of high-ranking officers along with scientists and 2 ISB agents, those being Major Partagaz and Dedra Meero. For this project, he says they're going to be going over to Gorman and they're going to be resourcing this mineral called calcite, which is actually used for coating the reactor lenses and helping generate vast amounts of energy and power. And we know Palpatine loves power. So everybody in this room, also previously like Galen Erso, is under the guise that this is some sort of energy research project that Palpatine's putting together, something that's going to last long and cost the Empire less, but we all know, of course, that this is just a front for the Death Star. Now this brings us to step 5, because Dedra Meero is also a part of this project, this energy project, but she also has her own side project where she is looking out for rebel activity or any type of rebel insurgents, and she's specifically looking for Luthen Rael, aka Axis, who they know at the time, basically someone who they know is high-ranking within the rebellion. So this brings us to step 6, where Dedra Meero is hell-bent on finding Luthen, and she is using every resource that she could possibly use in order to find him, and in doing so, she actually digs just a little bit deeper illegally into some files that were not meant for her eyes. Now, according to her, she never personally went into these files, but she just somehow, through some sort of communication error, received them on accident. And instead of, bringing it up or deleting them, she decides to keep them for herself in order to find, these rebel insurgents. And not only that, started to keep these files for the next 2 years. That's where she started to learn Palpatine's true intentions behind the energy project. And she also learned stuff, regarding, Scarif, Gorman, Kyber crystals, Galen Erso, all that stuff. everything basically she was not supposed to know. This then brings us to step 7, where there's another ISB agent known as Lonnie Young, who is actually a spy for the rebellion, who is within the Empire, and specifically being an ISB officer. So he steals her code cert and then goes in and logs into her files to see all that information, Death Star, Galen Erso, all that stuff. So basically a gold mine for the rebellion of information. So then this brings us to step 8, because Lonnie knows his cover has finally been blown because he stole her code insert. He knows that it's just a matter of time before they realize that it was him and that they're going to hunt him down. So because of that, he then churns the Luthen, hoping that he'll help him escape Coruscant. And also he does tell him, basically passing that information, that everything he has learned, Kyber crystals, the Death Star, Galen Erso, Scarif, all that stuff he passes over to Luthen. This then brings us to step 9, because Luthen unfortunately has to kill Lonnie because he knows that Lonnie knows too much about the rebellion and also the Empire and doesn't want to risk it, so he kills him. Then Luthen takes the information that he got from Lonnie and then passes it to Clea, his assistant slash partner. This then brings us to step 10, where Clea reaches out to the rebellion for help to pass on that message she just learned from Luthen about the Death Star, which is then where finally Cassian Andor enters the picture, because she then very urgently tells them everything she just learned about the Death Star. This then brings us to step 11, where Cassian heads back to Yavin 4 along with Clea and tells the rebellion leaders what he just learned about the Death Star. Unfortunately, the message of the Death Star is not received in the best way, because a lot of them don't find the information credible. Now, because the rebels don't fully believe this information and they don't find it credible, it probably would have stopped right there and nothing would have happened. Now, it might have all stopped right there. You know, the rebels didn't fully believe that information and they didn't act on it, and they might have not done anything until it was too late. But then this is where the Galen Erso part of the story comes in. So this brings us to step 12, and a lot of this is coming from the book Star Wars Catalyst, where Galen Erso finally learns the full reason of the Death Star project, and in doing so, he then actually ends up meeting Bodhi Rook, who's an Imperial pilot. He sees the potential in Bodhi and convinces him to deliver a message for him. Now, instead of delivering the message to the rebellion, he actually asks him to deliver the message to Saw Gerrera, because Galen doesn't fully trust in the rebellion just yet. And he knows that Gerrera, unlike the rebellion, is actually going to take the message seriously, as we saw in Andor Season 2. This brings us to step 13, where Bodhi Rook actually does defect from the Empire and escapes, and then because of this, word spreads to Saw Gerrera's men about the Imperial defector who is holding an important piece of information. This then brings us to step 14, where Bodhi finally arrives on Jeddah, and he's actually obtained by Saw Gerrera's men, and they receive the message from Galen Erso regarding the Death Star. This then brings us to step 15, where finally the Andor side and the Galen Erso side of the story finally interconnect. Around the same time, Andor receives a message from his friend Tivik, and Tivik is actually a friend of Andor who is actually a rebel informant inside Saw Gerrera's men. Tivik then asks Andor to meet him on the rings of Kafrene so he can tell him about the Imperial pilot. So this brings us to step 16, where Andor agrees to go meet him on the ring of Kafrene, and also keep in mind that the rebellion and Andor have only heard word of this so-called planet killer and a guy named Galen Erso from one person, that person being the recently deceased Luthen Rael, who again, the rebels didn't really consider credible on this information. So that's why Andor reacts in such a way when he is now hearing the name Galen Erso from a second source, because now this is making Luthen's story much more credible.
Someone named Erso sent him, some old friend of Saw's.
Galen Erso. Was it?
I don't know. They were looking for Saw when we left.
This then brings us to step 17, where Andor, now knowing that Saw Gerrera has this important information from an Imperial pilot that has come from Galen Erso, they decide to go rescue/obtain Jyn Erso, who is the daughter of Galen Erso, in hopes that she will help them basically get close to Saw Gerrera so they can receive this message. This then brings us to step 18, where Jyn, Andor, and K2SO travel to Jeddah, where they are finally able to receive the original message that Saw Gerrera had from Galen Erso about the Death Star. They also learn that Galen Erso designed the Death Star with a flaw, a weakness that will help destroy the entire station with just one blast to it. And he also tells them that this weakness and the full plans for the Death Star are actually being held on the planet Scarif. This then brings us to step 19, where Jyn, Andor, and K2SO travel back to Yavin 4 and give this information to the rebellion, and once again, they still don't fully believe this whole story, because it's coming from sources like Luthen Rael, Saw Gerrera, and Galen Erso, people who are not a part of the rebellion, who they, again, still don't fully believe. And so because of this, they once again decide to not do anything about this information. This then brings us to step 20, where against the rebels' orders, Jin, Andor, K2SO, and a handful of rebels sneak through the Empire onto Scarif to receive the Death Star plans. This brings us to step 21, where Jin finally obtains the Death Star plans, and unfortunately she is not able to escape Scarif before its destruction, but before that she is able to send the plans to Admiral Raddus of the Rebellion, who is just sitting right above Scarif. The next few steps actually go really quick, because in step 22, Admiral Raddus actually transferred the Death Star plans onto a data card, which is then received by this guy, which then goes to step 23, which he hands off to this guy before being slashed by Darth Vader. Step 24, he then hands it off to this guy, and then step 25, who finally reaches it over to Leia Organa. So those were just the really quick, fast-paced steps where it went from this hand to that hand to that hand. But then that brings us to step 26, where out of fear of being captured, Leia then passes the plans along with a message to R2-D2 requesting him to find Obi-Wan Kenobi. So inside that message, she is asking Obi-Wan to deliver R2-D2 and the Death Star plans over to her father, Bail Organa, on the planet Alderaan. So then that brings us to step 27, where R2-D2 along with C-3PO land on Tatooine and are later captured by the local Jawas. In step 28, the Jawas then sell C-3PO and R2-D2, who was still holding the plans for the Death Star, along with Leia Organa's message to Owen Lars, a moisture farmer on Tatooine. Which brings me back to my original point at the beginning of this video, where I think that this transaction right here is just insane, because the Jawas have absolutely no idea what they're selling. They think it's just some crappy R2 unit to a moisture farmer, not knowing it contains like the biggest piece of information that controls the fate of the galaxy. And had they known that, I think they could have sold R2 for a lot more money. But on the other hand, Owen Lars made an absolute steal for the price that he bought R2-D2 for. This then brings us to step 29, where Luke Skywalker, Owen's nephew, ends up learning about the important message within the R2 unit and then passes that information on to Obi-Wan Kenobi. In step 30, Luke and Obi-Wan then go off to hire Han Solo and Chewbacca in order to fly them to Alderaan so they can deliver the Death Star plans to the Rebellion. In step 31 though, however, they end up getting fully derailed as they are too late and end up flying through the debris of the once planet Alderaan, and instead actually end up getting captured by the Empire on the Death Star. Which I find this to be a really funny moment, because again, with season 2 of Andor, it just really amps up, Rogue One and Star Wars A New Hope, because basically the Death Star plans went in a full circle, from the actual beginning, just to end up back on the Death Star.
Ironic.
The Empire was so close so many times to basically capturing, and just so many times that they could have stopped the Death Star plans from leaking. This then brings us to step 32, where eventually, Han, Luke, Leia, all of them are able to escape the Death Star and finally deliver the Death Star plans to the Rebellion on Yavin 4, where just days ago, Andor and Jin left Yavin 4 in order to go get the original plans on Scarif, which then finally brings us to step 33, where the rebels learn of the exhaust port weakness that was put in place by Galen Erso. That way, just with a single blast, it would be destroyed. So because of that, they dispatch a bunch of pilots to go to the Death Star, through the trench run, and then finally destroy the Death Star once and for all. Wow. Once again, just the full timeline of that, just all the steps it took in order to get to that point, and how many times it could have failed, either by the Rebellion, by not passing along the message, or by the Empire. So many times of, the Death Star plans being right in front of them, and yet it slipped through their fingers. Just that full timeline, it's just interesting to think about all those steps it took. And it really shows, in my opinion, just the appreciation of just the creators of Star Wars. If I missed a step, be sure to let me know in the comments if there was something I missed, because again, I did a deep dive and I think I got all the parts, but if I did miss a step in there, let me know in the comments. So as I mentioned too, if you skip towards this tagline right here, I'm going to do just a quick, real fast, step-by-step bullet point of what happened in order for the Death Star plans. So starting from the top, here we go. Poggle the Lesser and the Geonosians design the plans and then pass those on to Count Dooku. Count Dooku then passes those on to Palpatine, aka Lord Sidious. Palpatine then decides to put Director Krennic in charge of the construction and passes the plans on to him. Krennic then accidentally passes it on to Dedra Meero, an ISB agent who is a part of the Energy Research Project. Lonnie Young, a rebel spy in the ISB, then steals the information of the Death Star plans. Lonnie then passes that information on to Luthen Rael. Luthen then has to kill Lonnie because he knows too much. Luthen then passes that information on to his partner Kleya. Kleya then passes that information on to Cassian Andor. Cassian then passes that information on to the Rebellion, who doesn't fully believe the information. Around the same time, Galen Erso, an energy research scientist, passes the information of the Death Star onto an Imperial pilot named Bodhi Rook. Bodhi then passes Galen Erso's message to Saw Gerrera. Tivik, a rebel informant inside Saw Gerrera's men, passes the message on to Cassian Andor. Cassian and the rebels obtain Jyn and Erso to help them get in contact with Saw Gerrera so they can receive Galen Erso's message. Jyn receives Galen Erso's message and then passes that message to the rebels on Yavin 4. Cassian, Jyn, and a handful of rebels then go to Scarif to receive the Death Star plans. They then send the plans to Admiral Raddus, a part of the rebellion who is just above Scarif. The plans are then transferred over to a data card by this guy, who then hands it off to this guy before being slashed by Darth Vader, who then hands it off to this guy, who then hands it off to Leia Organa. Leia gives the plans along with a personal message over to R2-D2. R2-D2 then lands on the planet Tatooine, gets captured by Jawas, and then is sold into the hands of Luke Skywalker. Luke Skywalker then learns of the message and passes it along to Obi-Wan Kenobi. Luke Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, along with Han Solo and Chewbacca, plan to bring the plans over to Alderaan to Bail Organa. Having showed up just a little too late, they get captured by the Empire on the Death Star, which is totally odd because the plans basically went full circle just to end up back on the Death Star.
Ironic.
Eventually, they finally escape and are able to bring the plans to the Rebellion on Yavin 4. The Rebellion, finally taking the message of the Death Star seriously, sends a squad of pilots to destroy the Death Star on the one weak spot that Galen Erso put in the design plans from the beginning. Wow, once again, Andor, Rogue One, Star Wars A New Hope, all that stuff, it just brings into full picture of what all had to occur correctly in order for the Rebellion to destroy the Death Star. If I miss anything, be sure to put it in the comments. Thank you guys so much for watching. And maybe in the future, if you learn of a massive super weapon by some sort of overwhelming power, maybe take it just a little bit more seriously.